Mary, Jesus' mom, has just learned she is going to give birth to Jesus Christ. And the Christ child that she knows has been foretold for centuries. It's a miracle because she's a virgin. She's engaged, but she's yet unmarried. And so let's read Mary's song. Verse 46, and Mary said, my soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones. He has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but he has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors. We just finished our lesson on Samson and a discussion on the book of Judges. So I just want to do a really quick recap since we have a couple of folks that weren't here for part of that conversation. So just as a recap, the book, it was about Israel's early years after the great leader Joshua. Over the centuries, Israel falls into a predictable cycle. They fall into idolatry. God allows foreign oppression. The Israelites cry out to God for deliverance, and God sends a judge to deliver them. The very last verse in Judges suggests that things don't get better after the judge's story. Verse 25, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. This is the end of the book of Judges, and it ends at a low point for the Israelites. There's new depths of immorality, some of the worst deeds that we find in the Bible. This is an important time in the history of the new Israeli kingdom. God is about to give the people a king, a good king, King David. But before we get to David, we have one last judge, Samuel, and we have Israel's first king, King Saul. Samuel is moral and ethical. He's faithful to God. Samuel warns the people that a king will draft its men into an army. Kings will tax them, and there will be abuses of power. But despite his efforts, the people ask for a king. Samuel selects a king, King Saul, and Saul is what you might look for in a king. He's tall and impressive. He's unassuming. He quickly has success in battle, but things go wrong. Saul disobeys God, and God sends Samuel to confront him. Ultimately, God rejects Saul, and God selects a new king, King David. By the way, Israel having a king is not a surprise to God. God did not wake up in the middle of the story and go, okay, fine, they're going to have a king. In Deuteronomy 17, gives the people guidance about some rules about the king. God is not caught surprise. He sets up the rules for the king centuries before the people ask for one. King David is an important figure in the Bible. 66 chapters in the Bible are dedicated to him, and he's mentioned in the New Testament more than 50 times. He's an important leader. He unites the kingdom. He leads the people for 40 years. He is a great military leader. God says, I have sworn to David, my servant, I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. God is going to build an earthly kingdom through David, but really, God is going to build an eternal kingdom through him. Further, God calls David a man after his own heart. But David committed some pretty atrocious sins, the sins of adultery, deceit, murder. Further, Deuteronomy 17 tells the people, their king, he must not take many wives, or his heart will lead astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. David does both. He has 7 wives. First Chronicles 22, verse 14 tells us that David gave his son Solomon, the heir to the throne, 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver, or about the equivalent of $158 billion today. David had some trials. David had to hide while King Saul, wanted to kill him. David destroyed his family with some of the things he did. David's son starts a rebellion against him. Throughout this, David wrote many of the Psalms, perhaps half of them. This is a crucial, important figure in the Bible history. Today, we're going to start a series on David over the next 12 weeks or so. But before we get into David, we're going to go look at 2 events in the lives of 2 important figures in David's early story. Today, I want to go back to Samuel, since he plays such an important role in Israel's first kings. We're going to use a couple of sources during the next 12 weeks, but there are 2 important sources I really wanted to point out. There's a book called A Tale of 3 Kings by Gene Edwards. Edwards really tells David's story in story form. He's imagining the details and David's feelings. The book was given to me, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's experiencing heartache and pain. And the other resource I use a lot is a sermon series by Tim Keller called The Gospel According to David. As you know, Stephanie and I are big Keller fans, and I borrow from Keller often. So let's jump into Samuel. There is a story about Samuel's birth that fits into a larger narrative in the Bible. And I'd like to spend today to kind of talk about that narrative, that theme. Next week, we're going to talk about Saul, Israel's first king, and then really dive into David and the events in his life kind of starting in 2 weeks. But again, the birth of Samuel. Let's read it. 1 Samuel 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Joraham, the son of Eliu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice the Lord Almighty at Shelah, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of his meat to his wife, Peninnah, and all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? First of all, notice Elkanah is trying to help. I think he's genuinely trying to help. He really does seem to love Hannah. He gives her a double portion of meat. Does it help? The text said her rival, the other wife, provoked her. What's going on here? The situation is causing animosity between these 2 wives. One wife, Peninnah, is producing children. She's giving Elkanah children. She's giving him future heirs. She's giving him a future. But this other woman, Hannah, is getting Elkanah's attention. Hannah is getting the husband's love. She's getting rewarded. How would you feel if you were Peninnah? When we read the text that Peninnah is provoking Hannah, my first thought was, how cruel. But reality, it's not that surprising. It seems quite natural. And how would you feel if you were Phinina? Continuing on, verse 9, once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will be used on his head. Now, again, I want to take y'all back to Judges, especially when we had the previous class on Samson. When we see that phrase, no razor will ever be used on his head, the implication is that Hannah's son will be a Nazirite. If you remember, there were 3 rules that marked a Nazirite: no drinking wine, no alcohol, no touching dead animals, and no cutting hair. Hannah is making a promise to God that if he would give her a son, she will dedicate that son to God to be a Nazirite, set apart to serve God from birth. I also want to take a second to talk about Hannah's suffering, because this is really critical. The text says she's weeping bitterly. She's in deep anguish. She's not eating. First, we understand this, don't we? Perhaps some folks on this call have had struggles conceiving, or you've lost a child during pregnancy. There's real hurt there. There's real loss. There's real pain. I have a friend of mine from high school. Him and his wife lost their first child during pregnancy. He told me that people would come up to him and his wife and say things like, at least this happened before the baby was born. People who haven't experienced loss like this really can't understand. There's real hurt here. Hannah is hurting. But it's worse for Hannah. During ancient times, children meant something more. Children were your future. Children were your security. We live in a world with Social Security and Medicare. We, our government, we try to provide for and take care of our elderly. Today, there's this nuclear family, and we've separated from the extended family. We live farther away. We live separate from our parents. But this is a new phenomenon. For most of humanity's history, there were extended clans. 3 and sometimes 4 generations might live together. Your children provided for you as you aged. During this time of Hannah and Elkanah, their children are their future. They will take care of her. Without children, what is her outlook? What future does Hannah have? Without children, her prospects are dim. For her, she will be a burden when her work life comes to an end. Early the next morning, verse 19, early the next morning they arose and worshiped before the Lord. And then they went back to her home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I've asked the Lord for him. Now, we've heard this story before, haven't we? God gives the barren wife a son after years of desperation and anguish. And then the child is used by God in profound ways. We see this with Sarah and Abraham. God had promised a future to Abraham and Sarah. You will be the father of many nations. But Sarah didn't get pregnant. In fact, Sarah became so desperate, she concocted an idea to give her maidservant to Abraham so that she could give him a child. Ultimately, Sarah at 90 years old became pregnant with Isaac. And we see in Matthew 1, Isaac is of the genealogy of Jesus. Could we say that Sarah having Isaac at 90 is a miracle birth? We see in the story of Leah and Rachel, see the same theme. Jacob was in love with Rachel, but Rachel's father tricked him into marrying Rachel's sister, Leah, before he could marry his love, Rachel. Leah has children. Rachel does not. Genesis 30, verses 22 through 24. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. she named him Joseph. Who was Joseph? You'll remember Joseph. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely imprisoned in Egypt. He was able to interpret the Egyptian Pharaoh's dream about an upcoming 7-year drought, and he was used by God to save their father, Jacob, who's also known as Israel, and his brothers, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. God used Joseph to save and keep Israel. This is a common theme. God blesses the barren woman, the woman with no future, no legacy, no hope, but he brings a child that will be used to change history forever. This is a motif we see over and over. Remember our theme. Sarah was barren. God does a miracle and blesses her with a son at age 90. Rachel was with a child. God gives her a son that saves Israel. Hannah was barren, and God gives her a son that becomes Samuel, the prophet who anoints the king, King David. The implication of these births are that they are all supernatural. God remembers them. God has compassion, and he intervenes, he directs. But there's one more miracle birth of a son who saves. Let's go back to Hannah, the mother of Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, we read Hannah's prayer. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He stumbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven, and the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. First question, does Hannah's prayer sound familiar? At the beginning of the lesson, we read Mary's song. Does Hannah's prayer sound familiar with Mary's, the mother of Jesus Christ? Does Hannah's prayer sound similar to Mary's? Mary conceived a child by the Holy Spirit, the ultimate miracle, the virgin birth. We see this theme of God supernaturally bringing a son to save. But was Mary barren and hopeless? Luke 1:27 tells us she is a virgin, but she was pledged to be married. There's no implication of hopelessness. Quite the contrary. Mary's about to get married. She's likely full of hope and excitement. Mary is not a picture of what we see in Rachel and Hannah. As we've learned, God saves through the barren woman, the hopeless. When reading these stories, you see a big difference like this. You've got to ask why. Who is the barren wife in Mary's story? If it's not Mary, if this story indeed fits our motif that God saves through the barren woman, the barren wife, who is the barren wife in this story? Perhaps we are. Sarah's future was hopeless, so God gave her a son. Rachel's prospects were dim, so God gave her a son. Our future was doomed, impossible. when we were lost, when we had no inheritance beyond this life because we had chosen death and we were separated from life, God gave us his son. It's in the prayer. It's in Hannah's prayer. Look at the language Hannah uses. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and he raises up. And then she shares the hope. God raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He sits them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. God sent Jesus Christ to die on a cross, put him in a grave, and then raised him up again 3 days later. God sent Jesus Christ to lift us out of the dust from the ash heap of an eternal death. And he gave us an inheritance of a prince. When we were barren, lost, and hopeless, God sent his son.